It was early April 1941, and the air over Europe was heavy with tension and dread. Across the continent, countries were bracing themselves for the unstoppable tide of war that Germany had unleashed. Few could have imagined the speed and ferocity with which Nazi Germany would bring a nation to its knees. On April 6, the skies over Belgrade darkened as waves of German bombers unleashed destruction on the Yugoslav capital. The sound of explosions echoed through the streets, and smoke filled the horizon as the city's infrastructure collapsed under the onslaught. In just a few days, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, a country that had struggled to maintain unity among its diverse ethnic groups, was reduced to chaos. What followed was not just an occupation, but a systematic dismantling of a nation, and the seeds of one of the most remarkable resistance movements of World War II were sown. Yugoslavia, by 1941, was already a nation riddled with internal divisions. Its population included Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Bosniaks, Macedonians, Montenegrins, and other smaller ethnic groups, each with distinct cultural and political identities. These differences, combined with decades of political instability and the lingering effects of World War I, meant that the country was ill-prepared to face the sophisticated machinery of the German war effort. The German army, with its blitzkrieg tactics, moved with astonishing speed, exploiting Yugoslavia's political weakness and military unpreparedness. Within days, German tanks and infantry advanced across the border, while Axis allies Italy, Hungary, and Bulgaria occupied strategic territories, fragmenting the nation further. The formal surrender of Yugoslavia came on April 17, 1941, a mere 11 days after the invasion had begun, leaving the population stunned and the country effectively erased from the map. The Axis powers did not merely occupy, they restructured the land to serve their military and ideological goals. Northern Croatia and large sections of Bosnia were handed to the newly formed puppet state, the independent state of Croatia, led by the Ustase, whose regime immediately implemented policies of terror and genocide targeting Serbs, Jews, and Roma. Italy annexed the Dalmatian coast and parts of Slovenia, while Germany controlled critical industrial zones. Hungary and Bulgaria claimed border territories, adding layers of oppression to the fractured landscape. For ordinary citizens, this division meant constant fear, starvation, and the daily threat of violence. Villages were destroyed, families were displaced, and the social fabric of the country began to unravel. The occupiers sought to crush not just the army but the very identity of Yugoslavia itself, yet their brutality only fueled anger and a longing for liberation among the population. In the midst of this turmoil, a man who would later become a symbol of resistance and unity rose to prominence. Josip Broz Tito, the leader of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, had long operated in the shadows as a political organizer, advocating for a socialist and united Yugoslavia. Unlike many contemporaries who chose exile or collaboration, Tito saw the occupation as a call to action. He recognized that survival and eventual liberation required not only courage but organization. By June 1941, when Germany invaded the Soviet Union, the Communist Party formally called for armed uprising across Yugoslavia. This was the moment when scattered acts of defiance coalesced into a movement that would challenge one of the most powerful military forces in the world. The early partisan fighters were ordinary people, drawn from villages, towns, and cities across Yugoslavia. They were farmers, laborers, students, and intellectuals, united by desperation and the desire for freedom. They were poorly armed, relying on hunting rifles, homemade explosives, or weapons seized from enemy troops. Yet their determination was formidable. They adopted guerrilla tactics, using the rugged terrain of Yugoslavia to their advantage. Mountains, forests, and remote valleys became strongholds where they could hide, plan, and strike with precision. Each small victory, each successful ambush, was a powerful statement: the occupiers would not face passive submission. Resistance had begun. From the outset, the partisans distinguished themselves from other European resistance movements through their emphasis on unity. Tito's vision transcended ethnic and religious divisions. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Slovenes, and Macedonians fought side by side, forming multi-ethnic units that symbolized the possibility of a united Yugoslavia despite decades of fragmentation. This approach was revolutionary in a region where nationalist ideologies often led to violence between communities. Tito understood that a divided resistance would fail. Survival required solidarity. The movement was as much about political ideology as it was about military strategy. It represented hope for a new Yugoslavia free, equal, and governed by principles of social justice. The challenges were immense. Axis forces responded to each act of resistance with overwhelming brutality. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were burned, and civilians were executed in mass reprisals. These campaigns of terror inflicted terrible human costs, yet they did not break the spirit of the resistance. In fact, they had the opposite effect, driving more people into the arms of the partisans. Each atrocity committed by the occupiers reinforced the legitimacy of the uprising and strengthened the resolve of those who refused to surrender. The struggle became not only a fight for territory but a battle for hearts and minds. By the end of 1941, the partisan movement had grown from small, disorganized groups into a structured, disciplined force. Fighters established liberated zones where they implemented rudimentary governance, providing order, education, and healthcare even amid war. They developed communication networks and supply lines, coordinating attacks and planning offensives with increasing sophistication. Civilians, inspired by the vision of liberation and the sense of protection offered by the partisans, continued to provide food, intelligence, and recruits. The movement was no longer merely a desperate insurgency, it was becoming a formidable national force. The significance of these developments extended far beyond Yugoslavia's borders. In a Europe dominated by Axis forces, the emergence of a well-organized resistance in the Balkans sent a message of defiance. The partisans were among the few groups in occupied Europe capable of sustaining prolonged military operations against a technologically superior enemy. Their survival and growth proved that occupation could be challenged, even in the darkest circumstances. By 1941's end, the Yugoslav Partisans had laid the foundation for what would become one of the largest and most effective resistance movements of World War II, a movement whose impact would resonate far beyond the war and shape the political future of the Balkans for decades. Guerrilla warfare, survival, and popular support. The winter of 1942 in Yugoslavia was harsh, unforgiving, and deadly, yet it witnessed the remarkable rise of a force that would confound the Axis powers for years to come. Villages in the rugged mountains and dense forests echoed with whispered plans of resistance, while the partisans, now more organized than before, prepared to wage a war unlike any other. They had survived the initial onslaught, but the fight ahead demanded ingenuity, endurance, and the unwavering support of the people. Guerrilla warfare became not just a strategy, but a lifeline for survival, allowing a small but determined army to challenge one of the most powerful military machines in Europe. Unlike conventional armies, the partisans relied on mobility and surprise. Knowledge of the terrain became their most valuable weapon. Steep mountains, dense forests, and hidden valleys provided both refuge and tactical advantage. Enemy patrols, convoys, and supply lines became targets for lightning raids designed to disrupt German and Italian operations. Every successful ambush, no matter how small, had a multiplier effect. It demoralized the occupiers, boosted the morale of fighters, and inspired ordinary citizens to join or support the cause. The partisans were no longer just a scattered band of rebels, they were becoming a formidable guerrilla army capable of shaping the course of the conflict in the Balkans. The human cost of this struggle was staggering. Axis reprisals were swift and brutal. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were razed to the ground, civilians executed, and essential resources confiscated. Starvation, disease, and exposure in harsh conditions claimed lives almost as relentlessly as bullets did. Yet, through all this suffering, the movement grew. Tito and his commanders understood that the survival of the partisans depended not only on combat success but also on maintaining the loyalty and trust of civilians. Fighters were disciplined to avoid looting or harming the population, which distinguished them from other armed groups in the region and reinforced their legitimacy. As the partisans consolidated their power, the movement began to evolve in scale and complexity. Units were organized into brigades and corps, with clear chains of command, operational planning, and coordination across different regions. Communication relied on messengers, coded messages, and knowledge of the terrain. Supply lines were painstakingly maintained with the help of local villagers who provided food, shelter, and information about enemy movements. Women, in particular, played a vital role, serving not only as nurses and couriers but also as combatants and political organizers. Their participation reflected the partisans' commitment to inclusivity and social transformation, principles that would define the movement beyond the battlefield. The ideological dimension of the partisan struggle became increasingly visible during this period. While fighting for liberation from occupation, the partisans also promoted a vision of a new Yugoslavia, one that rejected ethnic divisions, embraced socialist ideals, and sought equality across society. In liberated zones, local councils were established to oversee administration, education, and health care. These efforts were not merely symbolic, they helped to stabilize communities, provided practical governance in areas where the Axis had failed, and demonstrated that the partisans were capable of both military and civil leadership. This dual approach, simultaneously fighting and building, was central to their success. Not all resistance within Yugoslavia shared the partisans' vision. The Chetniks, a royalist Serb nationalist group, initially presented themselves as protectors of the monarchy and the Serbian population. However, over time, many Chetnik factions engaged in tactical collaboration with Axis forces to combat the partisans, whom they viewed as ideological rivals. This internal conflict added complexity to the struggle, creating a civil war within the broader context of occupation. The partisans, in contrast, emphasized unity and multi-ethnic cooperation, positioning themselves as a genuinely national resistance movement. Their ability to transcend ethnic rivalries and inspire a diverse population to fight alongside them set them apart in occupied Europe. By mid-1943, significant shifts were underway in the broader strategic landscape. Italy, a major Axis power in the region, surrendered to the Allies, leaving large territories previously under Italian control vulnerable. The partisans moved quickly to fill the vacuum, capturing weapons, ammunition, and territory. These gains allowed them to expand their operational capacity and integrate previously independent units into a more cohesive fighting force. Guerrilla raids became bolder, and the partisans began to exert meaningful control over regions of Bosnia, Croatia, Montenegro, and Slovenia. What had begun as a survival strategy was now evolving into a plan for full-scale liberation. The international dimension of partisan success also became increasingly important. British and American intelligence began to take notice of Tito's forces, recognizing their effectiveness against Axis supply lines and garrisons. By late 1943, the Allies formally shifted support from the Chetniks to the partisans, providing arms, advisors, and equipment. This external assistance strengthened the partisans' military capabilities and enhanced their legitimacy on the world stage. It also signaled to the local population that the movement was recognized internationally as the leading force against fascist occupation. Throughout this period, the partisans' ability to adapt was evident. They learned from each encounter, modifying tactics to counter enemy offensives and exploiting the weaknesses of Axis deployments. They integrated captured equipment, recruited skilled specialists, and even engaged in psychological warfare to sow confusion among enemy troops. Despite harsh winters, relentless attacks, and scarce resources, the partisans demonstrated remarkable resilience. Each success, whether a daring raid or the establishment of a liberated village, reinforced their credibility and encouraged wider participation from civilians eager to join a cause that appeared increasingly viable. By the end of 1943, the Yugoslav Partisans had transformed from a desperate, poorly equipped insurgency into a sophisticated liberation army capable of sustained military operations and political governance. They controlled significant swathes of territory, had a clear chain of command, and enjoyed broad-based support from the population. Their unique combination of guerrilla warfare, civilian engagement, and ideological cohesion allowed them to survive and thrive in one of the most hostile environments in occupied Europe. The foundations were now in place for the partisans not only to continue resisting the Axis but also to shape the post-war future of Yugoslavia. The survival and growth of the partisans during 1942 to 1943 stand as a testament to the power of determination, strategic ingenuity, and popular support. They proved that even under extreme conditions, a movement rooted in clear principles, inclusive vision, and tactical brilliance could endure against overwhelming odds. The winter and spring of 1942 to 1943, with all its hardship and danger, became the crucible in which the partisan movement forged its identity, resilience, and reputation, a reputation that would carry it through the remainder of World War II and beyond. International recognition and the road to liberation. By late 1943, the landscape of war in Yugoslavia had begun to shift in favor of the partisans, though the country remained deeply scarred by years of occupation, violence, and internal strife. The Axis powers, stretched thin by battles on multiple fronts, were no longer able to maintain the strict control they had once imposed. Across the rugged mountains, forests, and valleys, the partisans had carved out liberated zones, demonstrating not only their military skill but also their ability to govern and inspire the population. What had started as a desperate insurgency was now evolving into a legitimate force capable of shaping the destiny of a nation, and the world was beginning to take notice. The first signs of international recognition came from the Allied powers. British and American intelligence officers, initially cautious observers, began to see the partisans as the most effective anti-Axis force in Yugoslavia. Their reports highlighted not just the partisans' battlefield successes but also their ability to maintain civilian support and organize liberated territories. In comparison, rival groups such as the Chetniks, though numerous, were increasingly involved in local power struggles and collaboration with Axis forces, undermining their credibility. By the end of 1943, the Allies made a decisive choice: the partisans would receive official recognition, military aid, and strategic coordination. This endorsement marked a turning point, providing the resistance with both material support and political legitimacy. The receipt of Allied support transformed the partisans in practical and symbolic ways. Weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and advisors began arriving, often delivered by parachute drops or secret missions behind enemy lines. These resources allowed the partisans to expand their operations, mount larger offensives, and better defend liberated areas. Equally important, Allied recognition boosted morale among fighters and civilians alike, reinforcing the notion that the struggle was part of a broader global effort against fascism. The movement now had the dual authority of local legitimacy and international acknowledgement, a combination rare for resistance movements in occupied Europe. While military aid strengthened the partisans, their internal organization was also maturing. In November 1943, the Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, UFNOJ, convened in Jajce, Bosnia. This council, composed of representatives from across the country, formally rejected the authority of the Yugoslav government in exile and declared itself the future governing body of liberated Yugoslavia. The UFNOJ outlined plans for post-war reconstruction, emphasizing federalism, ethnic equality, and socialist governance. This political framework provided the partisans with a clear vision of what the country could become once the Axis was defeated, making their struggle both a military and ideological campaign. The growing sophistication of partisan operations became evident in the coordination of large-scale offensives against Axis forces. Intelligence gathering improved, units operated in a coordinated fashion across multiple regions, and liberated zones became models of governance and civic order. Hospitals, schools, and local councils were established, demonstrating that the partisans were not merely rebels but an emerging state in miniature. Civilian cooperation was crucial to these efforts, with locals providing food, shelter, intelligence, and manpower. Women played increasingly prominent roles, both in combat and in administration, reflecting the movement's commitment to inclusivity and social reform. This combination of military effectiveness and civil administration distinguished the partisans from other resistance groups across Europe. Meanwhile, the Axis powers recognized the growing threat posed by Tito's forces. German and collaborationist units launched repeated offensives, seeking to crush the partisans before they could consolidate power. The terrain that had once protected the fighters now became the stage for fierce confrontations. Ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks were conducted with increasing precision, draining Axis resources and diverting troops from other theaters of war. Despite relentless attacks and harsh winter conditions, the partisans adapted and survived. Their ability to recover, regroup, and continue operations underscored their growing reputation as a resilient and disciplined military force. The political dimension of partisan strategy became more pronounced as the liberation of territories progressed. In regions where Axis forces were forced to retreat, the partisans established local administrative structures that reflected their vision for a unified Yugoslavia. These liberated zones allowed the movement to demonstrate governance capabilities, enforce law and order, and provide essential services. By combining military action with civil administration, the partisans showed that they were capable of not only fighting but also ruling, a critical distinction that strengthened both domestic and international support. The arrival of Soviet forces in Eastern Europe in 1944 further altered the strategic situation. While Tito was careful to maintain autonomy, the presence of the Red Army provided additional pressure on German forces and facilitated coordinated operations to liberate key cities. The most notable achievement during this period was the liberation of Belgrade in October 1944, a symbolic and strategic victory that showcased the partisans' operational maturity. By reclaiming the capital in coordination with Soviet forces, the partisans demonstrated that Yugoslavia's liberation could be largely attributed to domestic effort, rather than reliance on foreign armies. Throughout 1943 to 1944, the partisans also faced the challenge of managing internal divisions and rival factions. The Chetniks continued to operate, often in collaboration with Axis forces, attempting to undermine Tito's authority and assert their own vision for Yugoslavia. However, the partisans' commitment to ethnic inclusivity, combined with effective propaganda and visible governance successes, gradually shifted popular support in their favor. By demonstrating that the movement was capable of military success, civil administration, and ideological leadership, the partisans strengthened their claim as the legitimate representative of the Yugoslav people. By the end of 1944, the partisans had not only survived years of brutal occupation but had grown into a credible liberation army and political force. Their operations had liberated significant territories, established functioning governance in liberated zones, and gained the formal recognition of major Allied powers. The movement's ability to balance guerrilla warfare, civilian engagement, and political organization had turned a desperate insurgency into a transformative force capable of shaping post-war Yugoslavia. The groundwork for national liberation had been laid, and the partisans stood ready to lead the country into a new era of freedom, governance, and unity. The period of 1943 to 1944 thus represents a critical phase in the history of the Yugoslav partisans. It highlights the transformation from a marginal resistance group into a recognized, organized, and disciplined force, capable of both military and political action. Their ability to survive, gain support, and assert legitimacy against overwhelming odds demonstrates the unique character of the partisan movement. The road to liberation, though fraught with danger, had been paved through courage, strategy, and the unwavering support of the people, setting the stage for the final chapters of Yugoslavia's struggle against occupation. Victory, power, and legacy. Spring of 1945 brought a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and anticipation to the rugged landscapes of Yugoslavia. After years of relentless struggle, the partisans had pushed Axis forces into retreat across the country. Towns, villages, and cities that had endured occupation, bombings, and reprisals now witnessed the advance of a homegrown army that had grown from scattered bands of rebels into a disciplined, multi-ethnic liberation force. For the people of Yugoslavia, the presence of the partisans represented more than military triumph. It embodied hope for reconstruction, self-determination, and a future free from oppression. What began as a fight for survival had evolved into a movement capable of shaping the post-war destiny of the nation. The final months of World War II in Yugoslavia were marked by a series of coordinated offensives that pushed German forces out of major regions. Tito's partisans, now organized into a national army numbering hundreds of thousands, combined conventional military tactics with their signature guerrilla expertise. Mountain passes, previously used to evade enemies, became strategic corridors for rapid troop movements. Ambushes disrupted retreating Axis convoys, and liberated towns provided staging grounds for larger campaigns. The fall of Belgrade in October 1944 had already demonstrated the partisans' ability to reclaim the capital with minimal outside assistance. In early 1945, the liberation of remaining territories signaled that the occupation had effectively ended, and that Yugoslavia's liberation was primarily the result of domestic struggle. The immediate aftermath of victory was complex. The partisans had to transition from a wartime resistance movement into a governing authority capable of managing reconstruction, social cohesion, and political legitimacy. The Anti-Fascist Council for the National Liberation of Yugoslavia, UFNOJ, established in 1943, now assumed a central role in forming the post-war government. Its members worked tirelessly to implement plans for federal governance, balancing the interests of different ethnic groups while promoting socialist principles. These measures were intended to prevent the ethnic fragmentation that had historically plagued the region and to ensure a stable, unified state. The establishment of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia was formalized in 1945, abolishing the monarchy and instituting a new federal structure composed of 6 republics: Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Tito emerged as the unquestioned leader of this new political entity, and his wartime leadership had earned him broad support both domestically and internationally. However, the consolidation of power also required difficult decisions. Former collaborators, political opponents, and members of rival factions were systematically removed or marginalized. The process was often harsh, reflecting the challenges of transitioning from insurgency to governance while securing long-term stability. Beyond domestic considerations, Tito faced the delicate task of navigating the emerging post-war international order. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, was extending its influence across Eastern Europe, yet Tito insisted on maintaining Yugoslav independence. Through careful diplomacy and pragmatic decision-making, he avoided full alignment with Moscow while still benefiting from the ideological and material support that Communist solidarity offered. This balance allowed Yugoslavia to pursue a unique path among post-war socialist states, ultimately becoming a leading member of the non-aligned movement in the following decades. The Partisans' achievements extended beyond military and political success, they also left an enduring social legacy. Women who had served as fighters, organizers, and administrators during the war gained new recognition in post-war society. Education and healthcare initiatives launched in liberated territories laid the groundwork for broader social reforms. Ethnic cooperation, once an ideal tested by the hardships of war, became a guiding principle of the federal system. These accomplishments demonstrated that the partisans had fought not only for liberation but also for the possibility of a new social order, one in which shared identity and collective effort could overcome historical divisions. While the narrative of partisan victory is celebrated, it is also marked by complexity and controversy. The struggle to eliminate collaborationist forces and assert authority involved harsh measures, and the post-war state relied on strict political control to maintain unity. Nevertheless, the extraordinary feat of surviving years of occupation, building an effective army, liberating a nation, and establishing governance with minimal external intervention is unparalleled in European history. The Yugoslav partisans demonstrated that resistance could be both militarily effective and socially transformative, setting a standard for liberation movements worldwide. By the end of 1945, Yugoslavia had emerged as a sovereign, unified, and independent state, shaped decisively by the partisan movement. Tito's leadership had transformed the country from a landscape of fear, division, and devastation into a federation with a clear political vision and the capacity to rebuild. The legacy of the partisans endured not only in the institutions they helped establish but also in the collective memory of a population that had witnessed the power of unity, resilience, and strategic ingenuity. Their story became an emblem of courage under occupation, proving that even in the darkest circumstances, organized resistance could triumph and lay the foundation for lasting change. The period following victory was also crucial for Yugoslavia's role on the global stage. Tito's insistence on an independent socialist path allowed the country to negotiate relationships with both Eastern and Western blocs, securing a position that avoided complete domination by any single power. This diplomatic skill, rooted in the experience and credibility earned during the war, established Yugoslavia as a unique player during the Cold War. The partisans' wartime successes had thus not only liberated their homeland but also positioned it to exert influence far beyond the Balkans. In retrospect, the final chapter of the partisan story highlights the full arc of their struggle, from scattered insurgents in 1941, surviving brutal reprisals and harsh winters, to a disciplined army, recognized internationally, capable of liberating its own country. Their victory was not merely military, it was political, social, and symbolic. The movement's achievements reshaped the nation, set a precedent for post-war governance, and left an enduring legacy of resistance, unity, and resilience. The partisans proved that courage, strategy, and collective will could rewrite the fate of a nation, leaving a mark on history that would resonate long after the guns fell silent.